Hello there, Guy.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Another special guest for this edition of the Weekend Blog on bloggingheads.tv. Guy Benson, why don't you introduce yourself and your background to the good folks in Twibland?
Well, I just moved to Washington, D.C. about 3 weeks ago.
I'm very sorry.
I'm brand new here. I'm the political editor at townhall.com. I've also been a contributor over at National Review Online for a couple of years. And I'm also a radio talk show host. So I wear a couple of hats, all of them on the right side of the spectrum, and this is my first appearance on Blogging Heads, so hopefully I won't crash and burn too badly.
So where can they hear the radio show?
In Chicago, although that might be changing. We might be expanding to a couple other cities as well, but the website is GuyBensonShow.com.
And can you get podcasts there too?
Yes, although at the moment you can only get older archive ones.
Okay. So if you want to get a sampling. And for those who don't know, I'm Bill Scher with Campaign for America's Future, ourfuture.org, also liberaloasis.com, where my podcast, The Liberal Oasis Radio Show, is also available. Why don't we get to it? Some of the big news today is there was some question whether the Republican Party would put forth something akin to a contract for America, an alternative policy agenda heading into the midterm election. And today they did. They called it the Pledge for America. But it seemed like the rollout was a little bit undermined from some criticism on the left, on the right, particularly Eric Erickson at Red State, calling it dreck and mom-tested pablum, nothing that Democrats wouldn't be able to undo, and saying he wanted something like a balanced budget amendment or a spending limitation amendment that would really lock in a rollback, a shrinking of government. Is Eric on an outlier here, or is there some broad dissatisfaction on the right that he's speaking to?
Well, look, the pledge, I think they call it the Pledge to America. No, it's fine. 21 pages, and it's being just ripped apart for all different reasons on the right. There are some voices out there defending it. Eric Erickson immediately denounced it. And look, I like Eric. I read his stuff frequently. I will say that, the guy's going to be selling a book about how awful the Republican establishment is and how it's pretty much his version of Marcos's book, but coming from the right side of things. So it's not necessarily an enormous surprise to me that he would be unsatisfied with something that the Republican establishment would put together. National Review, the editors over there, wrote an editorial praising it, which was also echoed by a couple of really smart guys like Yuval Levin. Ed Morrissey, who's a friend of mine over at Hot Air, he's said that it's a pretty good starting point, and let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So I would say mixed reviews. And of course, there's guys who are siding with Erickson, quite a few of them, who are very upset, don't think it's specific enough. And then another example of a slightly different take is Philip Klein at the American Spectator, who really is saying, look, guys, this isn't really objectionable in any way, it's just way too timid. And I think he made an interesting point, which was in 1994, with the contract with America and Newt Gingrich, you had unemployment around 6%. You had the budget deficit around $200 billion and shrinking. It was peacetime. The Cold War was over. The entitlement crisis was still decades away. Hillary Kerr had just been beaten back. So it wasn't quite as kind of desperate a situation, at least from our perspective, that the country was facing at that point. And so something a little bit more bold, with a little bit more teeth, was perhaps called for at this moment in time. I think that's...
Wait, what's the concern? Well, I'm hard to understand what the concern is here, because, is this a question about a concern that if Republicans took over Congress, that the policy agenda itself wouldn't be bold enough, or is there a political concern here that they're not going to get enough traction with it? Because I would think... quibble about the breadth of the policy prescription seems sort of a waste of time, because we all know if Republicans get into Congress, they'll try to, throttle Obama's ability to pass additional things and try to defund stuff that's already been passed. But there's no way they'd actually implement any of their own policies while Obama's in the White House. You just have a lot of conflict. So who cares if you don't have every last little thing that you want in this pledge? You'll still not have Obama passing his things, which would be the point, right?
Yeah, I think that that's probably true. I think that there is definitely substantive criticism of it, saying, people want more specifics, they want more details, they want a stronger language, stronger policies, as you said, much of which would never get past a veto pen, for example. And then some people are seemingly fairly upset that the pledge was kind of, looks like it was poll tested, and it's not, it's too political, and they're not ruffling any feathers. To which I respond, it's maybe not the worst thing to avoid ruffling lots of feathers right in the thick of the home stretch of a major campaign that you're trying to win.
Usually ruffling feathers involves losing.
Right, or at least, look, sometimes getting too specific during a campaign can hurt you. Look, if Republicans gain back the House, which I think they will, and the Senate, which is a longer shot, but let's say 2012, they win back the White House, win back the Senate, and all of a sudden they're in control of everything, and they're not doing anything, and their ideas are really tepid and boring and warmed over, then I think you'll see a lot of legitimate anger on the right. But for now, I look at this document, I scan through it, and I say, okay, yeah, this is fine. When Democrats come back and say, oh, look, they're the party of no, they have no ideas, there's a document to wave around that I think a majority of center-right people would back on a majority of points. So I'm not too worked up over it, but, that's not the case for a lot of people out there.
Now, there's a lot of concern on the left that there's going to be an enthusiasm gap coming that's going to hurt Democrats in this election.
Yeah.
You saw bloggers like Adam Scher at I'm sorry, I might be mistaking my bloggers. Steve Bannon over at Washington Monthly, looking at some of the Gallup data, showing that there's going to be big enthusiasm gap.
Right.
You have forgive me for my fumbling. But anyway, the point being that there's a lot of polling to show that Republicans are much more jacked about voting this time around than Democrats are at this point.
Right.
So when you have polling that shows all registered voters, you tend to have closer races. When they're doing likely voter screens, you're seeing much bigger margins for Republicans, generally speaking. Could something like this, is there enough ire about this in the conservative blogosphere that it would actually level that playing field of disenthusiasm, or is this just going to be, or do conservative bloggers don't have that level of ripple effect as far as the voting electorate is concerned?
Well, those are two questions. The first question is, will this have a discernible impact on enthusiasm or Republican turnout? My gut instinct is just a resounding no. I don't think that anything that the Republicans could have produced in this document, unless they, unless they said, maybe we like the stimulus in Obamacare after all. Short of that, this wasn't going to make too much of a difference. And bloggers are flexing their muscles and trying to pull the party in the direction that is more into their liking and tailored in their image or whatever. But our base is so fired up, it's not going to make a difference. Now, what I think is a little bit interesting is, I'm trying to remember who made this analogy. It was like years ago when I was just starting to follow politics, so I was like super young. And I remember someone talking about a crawling on glass election, where one side of the spectrum, one political base, is so desperate to stop and reverse what's happening on the other side that they'd be willing to crawl over broken glass to get it done. And I think we saw that in 2006 on the left, after 6 years of Bush and the Republicans controlling at least some of Congress, and then after 2004, all of it. 2006 was a crawl over broken glass election for the left, and I think 2010 is going to be that type of a scenario for the right. So I think there are very, very few kind of intervening events that could potentially happen that would dampen those spirits.
Fair enough. Now,
well, can I just ask you, like,
sure.
Like the left-wing blogosphere reaction to the pledge, is it just kind of a shrug? Is it mockery? Do you guys care at all?
Oh, there's been a fair amount of mockery, I'd say, on the left today. I mean, you certainly see a fair amount of posts, going after specific things, turning back the clock to Bush, more tax cuts for the wealthy, nothing on jobs, that kind of thing. My colleague, Richard Eskow at ourfuture.org and also the Huffington Post, called it, no jobs, no security, robbing the middle class. But you had a couple of more broader analyses. Paul Waldman at the American Prospect blog, Tapped, took issue with the notion of the pledge that the last 2 years have amounted to, quoting the pledge, an arrogant, out-of-touch government of self-appointed elites making decisions, issuing mandates, and enacting laws without accepting or requesting the input of many. And Waldman said, this wasn't a military coup, they got elected. And they do things like make decisions and enact laws. That's how the system works. Being the minority is no fun, but if you have a commitment to democracy, you have to realize that being the minority is part of the deal. It happens sometimes, and whining all the time about how oppressed you are may not be the best way to convince the country to put you back in charge. Now, I don't know if that's going to be, enough of a... If voters are looking at this press conference today so closely, they'd have a reaction like that.
No, they wouldn't. I mean, and quite frankly, whining and attacking is what worked really well for Democrats the last two cycles. So I guess that's kind of part of the
being a distinction between criticizing policies and saying that you had no right to do it, democratically speaking.
Well, I think that there was some of that, though. Bush is totally overstepping his constitutional authority. He's, eroding and stealing our rights. I mean, we heard all that type of stuff. I mean, I think there's a frustration that goes with being in the minority. And I think, at least in this case, of what we've seen, for example, with Obamacare, with one poll after another demanding that this bill not be passed, and even Massachusetts elected Scott Brown to try to prevent it from being passed, and they did it anyway. I think that probably ratcheted up, for good reason, some of that rhetoric about, elites ruling or governing against the will of the people. But yes, of course it's important to recognize that Barack Obama and the current Congress was duly elected. They were both, they were all duly elected by the people of this country. Maybe not Al Franken, but let's not go down that rabbit trail.
We all know Acorn stole the election for Al Franken.
So, yeah, that point is well taken, though, Bill.
Now, you had a couple other 2010 related posts yourself. There's still a lot of chatter about Delaware, whether the Republican voters in that state made a wise choice dislodging Castle and rolling the dice with Christine O'Donnell. Initially, Castle said, I'm not going to pull a Murkowski or a Charlie Crist here and try to go third party. But you've noticed there might be a change in Castle's calculation.
Right. And look, I've just spent probably the last 2 weeks bombarded by accusations of being an awful kind of Beltway elite rhino. Because, I've been here for 3 weeks. I've clearly become a Beltway elitist for having just a few reservations and, reporting facts about Christine O'Donnell. But the fact of the matter is she won the primary. She is the candidate, flawed though she may be. She's our nominee. Now the debate comes into, all right, she's raised $2 million. I think a lot of that came from how much she was attacked by more establishment Republican figures like Karl Rove. And I think Sarah Palin and Jim DeMint and the Mark Levins of the world were able to really gin up the base to say, look, our Beltway people aren't going to help this woman. We have to. And so she's raised $2 million. I think that's all she's going to need. There's, I think, lots of other Senate races that merit a lot more money and donations and perhaps better candidates, or let me say more viable candidates in other races. But yeah, in Delaware, there's this new interesting development, which is Mike Castle is at least making some noises about a write-in candidacy, which is, of course, what Lisa Murkowski is pursuing in Alaska, and I've been very, very critical of her for doing that. I am equally, on principle, critical of Mike Castle if he decides to go that direction, and again, he hasn't committed one way or the other. It just sounds like he's kind of toying with the idea. If he does, in principle, I'm against it. In practice, it could actually potentially help Christine O'Donnell, believe it or not, because I think that...
I don't believe it.
You don't?
I don't, but give me the case.
Okay, here's why, and this is not an original thought on my part. Ace of Spades and Jim Garrity were both writing about this earlier in the day. I think it is highly unlikely that too many Christine O'Donnell supporters would, and she's what, around in the high 30s now, like 38, 39%, looking at the polls. I don't think too many of those people are going to rush off to write in the name of Mike Castle and vote for him. I think it's more likely, considering his popularity and some of his center-left sensibilities, considering Delaware, that he would cannibalize more votes, perhaps, from Chris Coons than he would from Christine O'Donnell. I don't think it would make that big of a difference at the end of the day. I think Coons probably still wins if Castle even decides to pull the trigger. But I don't think it's completely absurd to suggest that Coons would actually take a bigger hit in terms of support if Mike Castle jumped in.
I mean, you don't know until it happens, of course, and I certainly haven't seen any data on it. I'd have to think Castle would take something from O'Donnell.
Yeah, I don't think it would be nothing, of course.
I mean, people who like to vote R, but might not be as conservative as O'Donnell is, might still vote for her in a two-person race and would say, I really wish Castle would get back in here. If you're only in the high 30s in a two-way race, you can't afford to lose very much to even win a three-way race.
Yeah, no, she's in a really tough position. There's no doubt about that.
I mean, is there any notion on the right saying, the folks who got really excited about O'Donnell, we took out the Rhino Castle, she can really do this, we got the money. You look at the poll number and said, geez, 16 points down, and she's taking a beating in the media. Maybe we need a plan B here. Maybe hey Castle, hey, sorry about what we said before. Maybe at least you give us a shot here.
No, and look, and at this point, it's over. There was a primary election. She won, he lost, and it should be over. But there's no sense. There seems to be no introspection whatsoever. It's too early for navel gazing and second guessing because the race is still going and things can happen and she could still win. She's barely spent any of this huge amount of money that she just raised. Who knows? No one thought, a week out that she'd ever beat Mike Castle. So it's way too early to start relitigating all that stuff. If she loses by a wide margin, I think there's going to be another really nasty, venomous debate on the right because it was ugly. It was really, really ugly for the week leading up to that primary. I think we'll go through all of that again. And I'm not...
I imagine that might also depend on how the other races go. If Republicans still took over the House and it was really close in the Senate, you might not get all hung up about one Senate race. But if there's a sense that
no,
a lot of races got blown because of Tea Party candidates, that might lead to a bigger circular firing squad.
Correct. I think that it is unlikely. For example, I think a Ken Buck and a Sharon Angle and a Joe Miller are much more viable candidates and very capable of winning in where Colorado, Nevada, and Alaska. I think O'Donnell. What has kind of bothered me about this whole debate is the idea that Christine O'Donnell has become the ultimate litmus test for true conservatism. Why? Why this woman? To me, it's absolutely nuts. But I hope she wins. If she doesn't, and the Republicans have a really, really good night, we'll probably be happy for quite a while. But someone inevitably is going to bring it up, being like, hey, by the way, Delaware, and then all hell will break loose. I guarantee you that.
Now, there seems to be some looking ahead to 2012 on the right. I mean, I imagine after the midterm elections, it won't be that long until folks start throwing their hat in the ring.
Right.
And since there's no obvious front runner right now in the early polling, no one really breaks out of the pack. You're still seeing some folks casting about for a white knight. Is that right?
I think that's probably a fair assessment. I mean, no one, and I wrote about this maybe last week, no one has announced yet, and part of the reason is it's early. But I think a bigger reason is, again, the base is so focused and still in, as I said before, that crawl over broken glass mentality. Anyone who would have like the grandiose, self-promoting event, like a presidential announcement before the midterm elections, I think would face an enormous backlash from the base. So I think everyone's kind of holding their fire for now. And there's a lot of people starting to kind of test the waters a little bit. The list seems to get longer and longer. And of course, people are talking about 2012. I think, having just moved here, I think I just have started a list of rules of political blogging, and one of them is it's never a bad time to irresponsibly speculate about the next presidential election, And so, of course, people are talking about it. And this also ties in, Bill, to something that you said before, which is even if Republicans win the Senate and win the House and are able to pass all this gangbusters, great conservative stuff, it's going to get vetoed probably every step of the way by President Obama. And so really, to affect the type of positive change we can believe in, we need someone else to occupy that spot, and thus these discussions are very tempting to get involved in.
So what's the favorite du jour on the right?
There isn't one. And I think, if the Mike Castle, Christine O'Donnell spat, just bloodletting, was any sort of preview of how things might go in a Republican presidential primary, it could be a highly entertaining / combative battle, to put it mildly. Of course, there are names out there almost guaranteed to run. Pawlenty, Romney, I'm pretty sure Gingrich. Palin is kind of hinting left and right that maybe she will, but maybe she won't. There's some people saying that it actually benefits her more to have people think that she might than actually throwing her hat into the ring. And there's a few other more dark horse type candidates like Mitch Daniels from Indiana, John Thune, the senator from South Dakota. John Bolton, former UN ambassador, has at least made a few remarks that were interpreted as maybe he's thinking about this as well.
You're just trying to give me nightmares, right? That's not really going to happen, right?
It could. We'll see.
Now, you noticed that there's a bit of a buzz around your former governor.
Yes. Well, he was actually my former state's current governor, right? Okay. Yeah.
You did not live in New Jersey under the glorious conservative realm of Chris Christie yet.
And I have not. It's really sad. Although I have to admit, I went home a couple of weeks ago, and I took the bus from D.C., which was like $2 or something insane. And as you're passing into New Jersey, they have the big "Welcome to New Jersey" sign that said Governor Chris Christie, and it was like this really exciting moment for me. That's how big of a nerd I am. I grabbed my BlackBerry to try to take a photo. And then I missed it. But yeah, he is one of my little tiny scoops that I've gotten here at Town Hall was that Chris Christie was going to be deployed across the country campaigning for fellow Republicans, mostly gubernatorial candidates, in the 2010 cycle. And that has turned into quite a list. I think he's going to 11 states. I think he's picked the races that he's wading into very carefully and very, very intelligently, savvy decisions. He's going where I think he can probably make a difference and where he'd have appeal. And so, of course, this set off another round of speculation about his presidential aspirations because, he's so far picking and winning major battles in the state of New Jersey. He's an absolute darling of the conservative blogosphere. He's talked about how he's got a trainer, he's losing weight, and now he's going around, scoring brownie points with fellow soon-to-be Republican governors, including Terry Branstad in Iowa, who does not have a close race on his hands. He's going to win by a huge landslide, and yet Chris Christie curiously decided to stop over there to give him some help. Probably not a bad guy to know. if you someday might need to have some friends in Iowa. So I actually really believe Christie when he says that he wants to clean up the state of New Jersey, be an effective, successful governor, maybe even get reelected before he'd even consider anything else. I believe him. But there are a lot of people who want to believe that he's got bigger things in mind much sooner than I think he's letting on.
Now, and there was some YouTube buzz about one of his appearances recently?
Yeah, today actually. He was, or I guess it probably happened yesterday. He was out in California stumping with Meg Whitman in her gubernatorial campaign, and this guy got up and started heckling Meg Whitman, and Christie literally walked off the stage and confronted the guy and just totally...
Was it a liberal heckler or a conservative heckler?
Yes, it was a liberal heckler, and Christie just kind of put him in his place. There are these moments, I think Glenn Beck probably, I think was the one who coined the term Chris Christie common sense porn, and it is spread like wildfire in the righty blogosphere where Chris Christie has these moments, like where the Democrats brought in like 3 bills that raised taxes on millionaires, and like he had a camera there and he vetoed them like one after another. There was one where he totally decimated this like snarky liberal reporter who was giving him problems. He's taken on, teachers' union members who have, confronted him at town hall meetings, and these things just go viral. Like conservatives cannot get enough delicious Chris Christie common sense porn. So this was just the latest installment, and he just defunded Planned Parenthood in the state, which of course has people, reaching for trying to faint onto a couch, and reaching for the smelling salts. Everyone's deliriously excited about that as well. So he's developing a really strong following, and I think he definitely has a future.
All right. Well, outside of going back to present day and not 2012 fantasies,
but it's so fun.
I know it's fun. I know you dream of the day when the Obama presidency comes to an end. But it exists today. Yet those on the left are still frustrated that a lot of stuff isn't getting done on his watch. And the latest thing to get filibustered is Don't Ask, Don't Tell, ending that and ending all discrimination against gays in the military. Also, immigration reform bill was filibustered along with that, the DREAM Act. But you had some dispute on the left on who deserves the blame for this latest filibuster, and this speaks to the question about how could Democrats get the progressive base enthusiastic about the midterms. You had Pam Spalding at Pam's House Blend and John Aravosis at America Blog, who have been two of the most dedicated and committed bloggers about these gay rights issues. Saying that gays are the battered wife of the Democratic Party, and to say that this is why it was important to get things rolling in the first 2 years. But no, the apologists told him to give him time. We'll get to that later, meaning all these gay rights issues. None of the smart people seem to believe that Congress could possibly be in jeopardy. Well, it's later. Look at the political slaughter we're facing at the midterms. And Aravosis, on top of that, basically chastised Obama for not working the phones to put pressure on folks. Basically, it was a fully Republican filibuster plus 2 Democrats, Pryor and Lincoln from Arkansas. You have needed to get in both of those Democrats and 2 Republicans to break the filibuster. Rose was saying that Obama was nowhere to be seen during the debate. Now you had a counter view over at the reality-based community, samefacts.com, by Mark Kleiman. So this is the John McCain filibuster. The fact that no Republican did the right thing, where almost every Democrat did, proves this wasn't a priority for the Democrats. Reading Obama might have well been able to twist the arms of Pryor and Lincoln, get them to vote right. But there's no way he was going to get the votes of 2 Republicans out of this right before an election day. And says, really, guys, this isn't rocket science. So there's continued, debate and division over where the blame should fall.
What do you think?
Either things don't get done at all, gay rights and carbon cap legislation, for example, or who to blame when legislation gets through, but with serious compromises, like with Wall Street reform and healthcare and the Recovery Act. All these debates seem to just constantly churn, and probably doesn't help the enthusiasm issue coming to the midterms.
Who are you blaming on this one?
Oh, I am generally one to blame the obstructionists themselves and not blame the president on these things. My general take has been, I think Obama has put his foot on the gas pedal as far as you could possibly put it. It's hard for me to see a scenario where more gets done than what has gotten done, even if it is insufficient on a number of areas. I get to say when, offer a scenario where the envelope is pushed further. The notion that I think a few phone calls or quote-unquote arm twisting is all sounds nice, but no one can really connect the dots to A to B, what would actually be said, what would actually be put on the table that would change the political dynamic within Congress.
I think there is a fair amount of bemusement on the right when there's, left-wing shrieking about how ineffective Barack Obama's been and how he hasn't done nearly enough left-wing things. And, meanwhile, we feel like we're just besieged by left-wing policy and initiatives and, various proclamations and executive orders. And I guess there's a certain element of both bases that will never be satisfied with anything. Because if Barack Obama's a big disappointment to the left, I shudder to think what type of candidate, what type of president would actually make them happy. So,
well, I mean, it's probably in the nature of being part of an ideological base to be dissatisfied.
Yeah, that's right.
In my mind, the question becomes, there's constructive dissatisfaction and debilitating dissatisfaction. I feel in most of my lifetime, the right has been much more productive with their dissatisfaction than the left has. Now, that might be changing with things like Christine O'Donnell, but during the Bush administration, I feel the right, kept an ample amount of pressure on the Republican establishment and got a lot of what they wanted out of it. And on the left, you have an example actually where liberal pressure was productive. I thought it was a much better Wall Street bill at the end of the process than at the beginning of the process, even though there still were compromises involved. But even in that situation, you didn't see a lot of people on the left really take a strong victory lap and sort of rejuvenate the base around it. And I think the whole notion of trying to discern whether it's Obama's fault or not in and of itself is not a terribly productive discussion to be having. It makes sense for either base to stay focused on the policies and not on the people, because once you start undermining the people who are on your team in the broadest sense, then you're going to be in a very politically weakened position.
Sounds sensible to me. I mean,
thank you, sir.
Yeah, I don't agree with you on the Wall Street bill at all. But I think in terms of just
well, from a liberal standpoint, I think you can say
exactly.
that it got more progressive as the debate went on, which is not usually how these debates go.
Right. Perhaps. But I think your larger kind of like the meta point there makes perfect sense to me.
Now, final issue that got a fair amount of attention this week. I actually sort of surprised it got less attention than I would have thought. Is the latest Bob Woodward book, Obama's Wars. I sense this got more attention on the right than the left, and perhaps more attention on the right than the mainstream media in general. But there seemed to be a fair amount of quote picking from the reported accounts of the book to push forth the narrative on the right that Obama is overly political in his handling of national security.
Right, and the war, and particularly Afghanistan. I was on Hugh Hewitt's radio show on Wednesday, and first question right out of the gate was about the Woodward book. I only read one Washington Post account of, what was in the book. So I've been so busy with so many things, I haven't had a whole lot of time to read long excerpts or anything like that. But yeah, I think that there is some sense that there's the White House is has some disarray on national security issues, that there's the national security team sometimes siding against more liberal political people, the sense that Barack Obama, despite talking about this great game about how Afghanistan's really the war of necessity, it's a war we have to win, how he really never wanted to use the word victory at all, how he was just looking for, any excuse to get out as soon as possible. I think one quote that I think was inartful on his part, but I think has been unfairly twisted, is the bit about being able to absorb another terrorist attack. Did you read about this one?
Oh, yeah. And in fact, Steve Bannon at the Washington Monthly had a dissertation on that, saying this is nothing that Republicans didn't say when Bush was in office. Right.
So when I saw that, and I could see some of the outrage machine starting to get fired up a little bit on the right, saying, okay, it's probably not a good way to put it. It may have come across as callous, particularly because 3,000 Americans didn't absorb the 9/11 attack. They were murdered by radical Islamists, and so to say that we can take another one, we'll absorb another one. I can see why some people could get their dander up, but I think all the president really meant by that was something that none of us would really object to or disagree with, which is if we get hit again, which I think unfortunately we will be at some point, we're a strong, resilient country that will not be forever, knocked to its knees by an attack. That's all that I really read from that statement myself.
And it seems like in the broader context of his comments, he was also making the point that a nuclear terrorist attack would be a different story.
Right. Yeah, I think he called it a game changer.
Distinction between the types of terrorist attacks and to the degree you have to prepare. You can't afford a single mistake.
Right. That's
when it comes to nuclear terrorism.
That's right. So I think that I definitely agree with you on that.
But otherwise, on the left, I was a little surprised. Perhaps I shouldn't be, but obviously there was definitely, I think, the initial psychic break between a portion of the left with the president was over Afghanistan, and I was interested in the fact that the book shows Obama's deep skepticism about continued involvement there, and I would have thought that might be soothing to those folks on the left to know, okay, wait, maybe he put more troops in than I would have wanted.
Yeah.
But at least I know that he does not want an endless war there. He is trying to get out at some point, so that at least puts me a little bit at ease. But the commentary that I was reading on the left, for example, Adam Scher over at the American Prospect, saying, I'm unsure this changes the political dynamic in the war since it mostly confirms what people skeptical of the war already thought. We're still left with liberals who see the war as no longer worth fighting and are right that whether it does or not will sense a political advantage in portraying Obama as too weak to commit to getting the job done. We'll see whether it matters that the American people are as ambivalent and exasperated about the war as the president himself. And over at newshoggers.com, which often has a foreign policy focus, saying Obama's already decided that portrays his war that way is the way to go, perhaps because he believes he won't lose the whole Democratic Party if he lets Petraeus take the lead and hides behind the Teflon general. So, I personally took a whole different take of it, which was, and obviously the right's taking it differently, focusing on that line he apparently said to Lindsey Graham saying, a war without end means I lose the entire Democratic Party, to infer that Obama's being very political about it.
Right.
It seems to me that you can't look at that quote separate from the fact that he put more troops in. So he holds all the skepticism, yet made a decision based on all the available evidence that he had.
Right.
That at least for a period you can't walk away. That the whole thing you can't just pull the plug on it and be responsible from a national security standpoint. Whether that's right or wrong.
Right.
It at least shows to me he is not being crassly political in how he goes about it.
Well, let's be clear. No one is, on the right or anywhere else is, a fan that advocating endless war anywhere where American troops are dying. That no one wants that, of course.
Well, some of the Petraeus quotes seem to think that he does.
Endless war with American troops dying is what General Petraeus wants.
Well, dying, no, but there were quotes that were taken out that said, this is something that we're going to walk away from in our lifetimes.
Yeah, I think that probably the threat of radical Islam is not going anywhere anytime soon, unfortunately. So I would agree with the general there. But I think that Barack Obama, that one of the areas where I have been least critical of the president is on Afghanistan. And on my radio show, I strongly defended his troop surge decision and the speech that he gave. I thought that the way he handled the Stanley McChrystal dust-up was one of his more thoughtful and presidential moments. It's been interesting watching him thread the needle, because I think in his heart of hearts he is a dovish, kind of weak, peacenik type liberal guy. And he was able to kind of camouflage that during the campaign, because most Americans, don't want someone who's perceived to be weak on national security, of course. So he was able to kind of separate and play this game between Iraq, bad, war of choice, Bush, versus Afghanistan, good, war of necessity, we're going to win it. And that was fine for most people. And I think a lot of people on the left assumed that was a wink and a nudge, saying like, okay, he's one of us. And a lot of moderates are saying, okay, he's not totally irresponsible, and Afghanistan is an important effort for us to win. And then once he's gotten into office, I don't think he and his political people can be that upset about that part of the book at all, because a lot of the left will probably read that and say, you know what, yeah, he is one of us. He's fighting against Hillary Clinton. He's fighting against Admiral Mullen. He's fighting against General Petraeus behind closed doors. But then the right comes back and says, but ultimately, as you just pointed out, he made the right decision. So he really is threading the needle. I think some of the comments that he reportedly made that are supposedly or apparently in this book that I've read, they give me pause. They're a little bit alarming and disappointing and confirm some of my fears about his mentality. But some of the actual commander-in-chief type decisions that he's made, specifically about Afghanistan, I don't find myself wanting to quibble or call him out on that stuff.
What I find more and more interesting about how the White House under President Obama operates, is the fact that the more and more we learn about the inner workings. You can look at this book and say dysfunctional foreign policy, warring camps, and all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. But it looks to me like you have a White House and an administration that cultivates differing viewpoints and wants to have internal policy discussions before reaching a conclusion, not having knee-jerk assumptions. There's another book that came out this week, Stephen Ratner's book about the auto bailout. Yeah. Forgive me, the title of the book's escaping me. But it's sort of along the same lines. There's one situation where everyone in the room is, I think, arguing against intervening, if I remember the story correctly. Forgive me if I'm flipping the positions. But then it was noted that, Austin Goolsbee thinks something different, and Obama's like, well, where's Goolsbee? Why isn't Goolsbee in the room? And then they go get Goolsbee, and they make sure that that viewpoint is represented, and they have a full airing of the debate in front of him before making the call. And that seemed to be the same deal with Afghanistan, that they, even if Obama wasn't satisfied with what he was getting, he went back and back and back and pressed to make sure there was a completely rich discussion and a full understanding of the choices before making a call. It strikes me as perfectly presidential thing to do. It doesn't necessarily, you might make a wrong decision still. It doesn't mean that he's an infallible person that we should be, following blindly. But at least that he is approaching the job in a deliberate and responsible way.
All right. And I guess the caricature on the left was that if that type of thing, those types of deliberations never took place in the Bush White House, which I think is, untrue. But anyway, I think the other thing that's along those lines, maybe to play devil's advocate and an example to the contrary on that is, the White House certainly has on multiple occasions had a very aggressive agenda. And you had, I believe it was Rahm Emanuel, leveling threats against potential wayward Democrats in Congress, talking about, don't think we're not keeping score. that type of thing. So there's definitely some degree of, ideological zeal, and the where, having the desire to actually implement it, and if that means kind of getting a little, not maybe bullying, they're going to make it. I mean, look,
they played some hardball.
Right. They played super crazy hardball with the Chrysler bondholders who were holding out, and they were threatening to sic the White House press corps on them for just demanding what was legally theirs. So I mean, I think
there's a difference between what happens internally in the White House before reaching their own policy conclusion, and then what they do after the conclusion is reached, and how they interact with Congress or interact with other stakeholders.
Sure.
And I think the Rahm case is a very interesting one. I mean, the Rahm gets a lot of slings and arrows from the left because it's been reported internally he has been a voice for smaller policies, more incrementalist policies, didn't want to do comprehensive health care, for example. But he never actively undermined the president once the decision was reached. So he loses the health care policy battle within the White House, but he goes to the mat for the policy when dealing with Congress. I mean, that to me is what you want from a staff member.
Yeah. The vitriol directed at him surprised me when he was kind of and is considering running for mayor in Chicago, which is where I moved to D.C. from, by the way. I was in Chicago for the last 7 years or so, college, and then afterwards.
You survived the machine.
I did, although, I barely. Although, as I said, kind of trading one political cesspool for another. But anyway, these angry, websites cropping up, Rahm can't be mayor, let's all unite against Rahm Emanuel, that awful, squishy, accommodating, right-wing appeaser. It's kind of like, who are they talking about? This is the same Rahm Emanuel who was, had a butcher's knife and he was stabbing into the table listing President Obama's enemies. We're talking about the same guy, right? So, again, that goes back to borrow a phrase that was hot maybe a year ago, epistemic closure. I think there's a certain degree of epistemic closure, or at least, blinders that both sides get, where the other side is just, when you look at it from the outside, you're just totally perplexed, what kind of bizarre debate are they having over there? And I think that's one of them.
Why don't we leave it on that note? I think we largely agree on that point. I wouldn't necessarily characterize everyone on the left quite that way, but I agree that the focus on Rahm has always been a little bit misplaced. We'll leave it on a note of general agreement.
Sounds good.
It's been good to talk to you, Guy.
Yeah, very nice to meet you virtually.
Why don't you tell folks again where they can see your work?
Sure. The bulk of my work is at townhall.com/tip sheet. It's the blog. It's on the main menu right across the top, the bar tip sheet. I blog regularly there, and I have occasionally columns or articles on the main page as well.
All right. Well, that's been this edition of the Weekend Blog, and we'll catch you next week for another edition. Have a great week.
See ya.